My name is Bill Cork, and I'm here going to be talking to you about Adventists and War. My background is I had 20 years as a chaplain in the U.S. Army Reserve and National Guard, and 9 years as Assistant Director of Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. What I want to look at is the slippery slope that's taken place that has changed the Adventist Church from a denomination that was consistently against war and killing to one where it really doesn't matter what you do. Let's start at the 19th century when Adventism arose. It was a period of reform, and early Adventists took part in most of these major reform movements, having to do with child labor, temperance, education, health, the anti-slavery movement, women's rights, and non-resistance, that is, nonviolence, a rejection of war. One of the most famous abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison. And in 1838, he founded the New England Non-Resistance Society to say that, yes, we're against slavery, but we only want nonviolent means to end it and to change people's minds. Other famous members of his organization included Bronson Alcott, Adin Ballou, and Joshua V. Himes, who not long after met William Miller and became his publicist and made his movement grow. And this is what Garrison said in the founding documents of the New England Non-Resistance Society. Our country is the world. Our countrymen are all mankind. We love the land of our nativity only as we love all other lands. The interests, rights, liberties of American citizens are no more dear to us than are those of the whole human race. Hence, we can allow no appeal to patriotism to revenge any national insult or injury. The Prince of Peace, under whose stainless banner we rally, came not to destroy but to save even the worst of enemies. So it starts from a Christian perspective, affirming the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of humanity. He continues, we register our testimony not only against all wars, whether offensive or defensive, but all preparations for war, against every naval ship, every arsenal, every fortification, against the militia system and a standing army, against all military chieftains and soldiers, against all monuments commemorative of victory over a fallen foe, all trophies won in battle, all celebrations in honor of military or naval exploits, against all appropriations for the defense of a nation by force and arms on the part of any legislative body, against every edict of government requiring of its subjects military service. Hence, we deem it unlawful to bear arms or to hold a military office. Now, where's Garrison getting this from? I think he inherited it from the Quakers, who were also involved in the anti-slavery movement. But this is a position that had been held by Anabaptists as well, though they were a much smaller force in the United States at this time, especially not in New England. It was the Quakers that were present in New England at this time. He continues, we know not where to look for Christianity if not to its founder. And taking the record of his life and death, of his teaching and example, we can discover nothing which even remotely, under any conceivable circumstances, justifies the use of the sword or rifle on the part of his followers. On the contrary, we find nothing but self-sacrifice, willing martyrdom if need be, peace and goodwill, and the prohibition of all retaliatory feelings enjoined upon all who would be his disciples. So it's not philosophical, it is Christological. It is following the teachings of Jesus as revealed in the New Testament. Now, as I said, one of the founders of this New England Non-Resistance Society was Joshua V. Himes. And through that, William Miller came into this orbit as well. And Garrison said about William Miller in 1843, the cause of temperance, of anti-slavery, of moral reform, of non-resistance finds in him an outspoken friend. So here, very clearly, he includes Miller in this camp of people who are pushing nonviolence. And Miller knew from experience what war was about. He was a captain in the War of 1812. And he turned his back on that and began studying the scriptures. And he began to study these prophecies that he thought pointed to the return of Jesus. But no, he wasn't just about waiting for the end. He felt called to make a difference now in anti-slavery, and so many of the other early Adventists were involved in this. Here's just one example of what Miller said, and this was something that was quoted by Seventh-day Adventists later. In 1844, in the Advent Herald, he quotes James. He says, they, Christians, must not countenance nor support war, for that cometh from lust. James 4, 1-3. They must not have respect to the rich and despise the poor, for that is judging unrighteously. James 2, 1-10. So there's this social justice awareness and this insistence that Christians and military service are utterly incompatible. Now, Sabbatarian Adventism, that is that Adventism that came out of Miller's movement and that came to believe that the seventh-day Sabbath or Saturday was binding upon Christians, that begins to rise in the late 1840s, early 1850s. A key moment for how they looked at the world was in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law, which required that any slaves escaping to the north had to be arrested and sent back down south. Ellen White, the Adventist prophetess, said, "The law of our land requiring us to return a slave to his master, we are not to obey." She was an active abolitionist and preached civil disobedience. 1851, Joseph Bates, former sea captain who became one of the early Seventh-day Adventist leaders, identified the U.S. as the beast with two horns that comes out of the land in Revelation 13. 2 years later, Uriah Smith says that one of the identifying marks of that beast is that it enforces slavery. So today, Adventists look at this beast that rises out of the land, has two horns like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. Adventists talk about this as being the U.S., but only that time in the future when it starts requiring Sunday observance. But for the early Adventists, no, they saw that as the United States now, because it was hypocritical, because it talked about freedom, but it enforced slavery, and even the free states were bound to return slaves down to the south. Now here's a picture that was Uriah Smith had done in 1853 showing this beast. And it is a composite beast like with the features of the beasts of Daniel chapter 7. But here it's a horrible thing, but notice the chains that are wrapped around its legs. One is slavery, one is creeds. Now, as we look at the relationship between Seventh-day Adventists and the draft, which came up during the Civil War, and when it was first proposed in 1862, there was a lot of debate back and forth in the Review and Herald. James White said, hey, you got to give in. It'll be suicide to resist. And there are some historians today and apologists for militarism in the Adventist Church who will say, oh, look, the church wasn't united. There were all kinds of different opinions then. Well, there was, but that wasn't the end of it. They debated it, and they came to a conclusion. March 3rd, 1863, the first draft law in U.S. history was enacted, and it provided for payment of $300 for a substitute. And the Adventist Church was small. They didn't have many people getting drafted, so they were generally able to raise that money. Well, too many people were taking advantage of that. And so the government began to look at how do we close that loophole. Well, in 1863, May 21st, this General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists was officially organized in Battle Creek, Michigan. And the following year, the conscription law was revised and said the only people who could take advantage of that $300 substitute were members of religious denominations that were historically opposed to bearing arms, meaning For instance, the Quakers and the Anabaptists. So in those next few months, the Adventists put out a couple of publications. The views of Seventh-day Adventists relating to bearing arms is brought before the governors of several states and the Provost Marshal General with a portion of the enrollment law. The other, compilation of extracts from the publications of Seventh-day Adventists setting forth their views of the sinfulness of war. And this booklet gives text from Adventist publications from the 1840s into the 1860s saying, look, even though we were officially organized only in 1863, we've been around for 20 years. We count this as our heritage. This was our movement, and we have been consistently from that time opposed to war. In the 1840s, Adventists were very much opposed, like most abolitionists, to the Mexican War, which they thought was just an illegal land grab of Mexican war for the sake of slavery. Our neighbors, the Mexicans, undertook some years ago to obey God by breaking the yoke of their slaves. That was something Santa Anna did, and that was one of the things provoking the Texas Revolution in 1836 is Stephen Austin and company wanted to keep their slaves. Santa Anna said, you have to get rid of them. That was part of their reason for rebellion. This was too much for the most enlightened nation under the sun to bear, so a revolt ensued, and finally we took a part of their territory from them. Texas was annexed to the United States that year of 1846. And one portion of the professed church in this boasted land of Bibles and converts have held a convention in their zeal for God, as they would have it, have chosen the chief murderer with some of his principal associates and made them honorary members of the Methodist Missionary Society during their lives. So they're saying, look, even these churches are advocating this use of violence to extend slavery and steal land from another country. Then in the 1850s, we see a number of statements. Again, these are published in this tract, along with many others. From the Review and Herald, December 1853, quoting a Methodist publication, the Wesleyan, professing Christians as well as infidels have tried to prove that the Bible sanctions slavery and war and polygamy. The Bible nowhere lends its high and solemn sanction to any form of moral evil. Signs of the Times by James White, 1853. The church is unlawfully wedded to the world. This may be seen in the various departments of civil government. Even in the War Department, the professed minister of Jesus Christ is seen mocking the God of peace with his prayers for success in battle. Early Adventists did not care for military chaplains. You see that here in James White, and especially later in an Army veteran, A.T. Jones. Thought it was completely a violation of separation of church and state and a lending of a religious gloss to the brutality of war. 1856, Advent Review. Has the gospel of Jesus granted you the right to use the sword, to arm you with carnal weapons, to take the sword, to provide your own household, to take the oppressed out of the power of the oppressor by breaking the sixth commandment of God, thou shalt not kill? Jesus says, love your enemies. We get into the 1860s. Here's J.H. Wagner, the father of the later evangelist and medical doctor E.J. Wagner. They boast of their connection with politics as an evidence that they are going to evangelize the nation. But they're not elevating the politics of the nation to a level with Christianity. They are lowering down Christianity to the level of the most degenerate national policy. And then a little bit later, it's quoting another, an anti-Christian document that's being satiric, but they're saying, they're right. Do we not send out our reverend chaplains with our invading armies to invoke the blessing of God upon our battles? Do not our churches rejoice in our victories and thank God that our enemies have been put to flight at the point of the bayonet or by the edge of the sword? Do we not present the beautiful and sublime spectacle before the heathen world and before angels and God of one Christian and hostile in deadly array against another? How then is the converting the world to such Christianity to put an end to war? And then 1861, M.E. Cornell in the Review, the sentiment of a popular minister that Sharp's rifles are the best peacemakers shows how they would introduce their millennium. So now when we read in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers, we must understand it. Blessed be Sharp's rifles. Truly they have put darkness for light and turned things upside down. But let us not sleep as do others. So there's several things here. One is the Christian rejection of violence. The other is complete separation of church and state, keeping the church separate, not getting mingled in with politics, certainly not blessing war, because they see that the moment the church gets entangled with political issues, it drags it down. And then in that other tract, there are letters that they wrote to the governors, pleading for being recognized as one of these churches that has always consistently rejected violence, and saying this is why our members should be included under this provision of the draft law. So August 1864, the General Conference officers wrote to the governor of Michigan, the denomination of Christians calling themselves Seventh-day Adventists, taking the Bible as their rule of faith and practice, are unanimous in their views that its teachings are contrary to the spirit and practice of war. Hence, they have ever been conscientiously opposed to bearing arms. Well, how can they say this if they only thought that the church was founded a year before? Well, obviously, by these other passages, they're understanding that Adventism came about in the Millerite movement. And so, therefore, these quotes from the 1840s and 1850s, well before the GC was established, showing the consistent opposition of Adventists to bearing arms. If there's any portion of the Bible which we as a people can point to more than another as our creed, it is the law of 10 Commandments, which we regard as the supreme law, and each precept of which we take in its most obvious and literal import. The fourth of these commandments requires cessation from labor on the seventh day of the week. The sixth prohibits the taking of life, neither of which, in our view, could be observed while doing military duty. So they're saying, we believe in keeping all the 10 commandments, the Sabbath and thou shalt not kill. These are held up as equals and as equal reasons why they cannot participate in the military. In a letter to the Illinois governor, also in 1864, they had testimony from a public official who said, there is in this part of our state a number of church organizations of the Seventh-day Adventists who are as truly non-combatants as the Society of Friends and who are conscientiously opposed to bearing arms. So Garrison starts teaching non-resistance, I think, because of his friendship with Quakers. And now they're saying that Adventist non-combatancy is identical to that of the Quakers. Look at them in the same light. Don't think of them as separate. They're doing the same thing for the same reasons. That's how Adventists saw themselves. One of the best expositions comes from an article that Review and Herald manager George Amidon had in the Review and Herald of March 7th, 1865, and this becomes published as part of that pamphlet on reasons why Adventists are not partaking in military service. Now, a friend of mine, he says, well, they were only opposed to the draft because of the Sabbath. No. As we've already seen, because they believed in the keeping of the commandments and because of wanting to follow the example and the teachings of Jesus. And Amidon spells this out, and I think it's a beautiful statement. Why Seventh-day Adventists cannot engage in war. They could not keep the Lord's holy Sabbath. Yes, that's true. The seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Fighting, as military men tell us, is the hardest kind of work, and the seventh day of all days would be the least regarded in the camp and field. Number 2, the sixth command of God's moral law reads, thou shalt not kill. To kill is to take life. The soldier by profession is a practical violator of this precept. But if we would enter into life, we must keep the commandments. Matthew 19:17. 3, God hath called us to peace, and the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, 1 Corinthians 7:15, 2 Corinthians 10:4. The gospel permits us to use no weapons but the sword of the Spirit. Number 4, our kingdom is not of this world. Said Christ to Pilate, if my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight. John 18:36. This is most indisputable evidence that Christians have nothing to do with carnal instruments of war. Number 5, we are commanded to love even our enemies. But I say unto you, says the Savior, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Matthew 5:44. Do we fulfill this command when we blow out their brains with revolvers or sever their bodies with sabers? If any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he has none of his. Romans 8:9. Number 6, our work is the same as our masters who once said, the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. Luke 9:56. If God's Spirit sends us to save men, does not some other spirit send us to destroy them? Let us know what manner of spirit we are of. Number 7, the New Testament command is resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Matthew 5:39. That is, we had better turn the other cheek than to smite them back again. Could this scripture be obeyed on the battlefield? And number 8, Christ said to Peter as he struck the high priest's servant, put up again thy sword. Matthew 26:52. If the Savior commanded the apostle to put up the sword, certainly his followers have no right to take it. Then let those who are of the world fight, but as for us, let us pray. So there is a solid argument, 8 points, multifaceted, arguing why Christians must be non-resistant, must have nothing to do with military service. And so it became then not just a pragmatic matter, but it was officially voted on as Adventist doctrine at the 1865 General Conference session. Our views of war resolved that we acknowledge the pamphlet entitled Extracts from the Publications of Seventh-day Adventists, setting forth their views of the sinfulness of war as a truthful representation of the views held by us from the beginning of our existence as a people relative to bearing arms. Our duty to the government resolved that we recognize civil government as ordained of God, that order, justice, and quiet may be maintained in the land, and that the people of God may lead quiet and peaceable lives in all godliness and honesty. In accordance with this fact, we acknowledge the justice of rendering tribute, custom, honor, and reverence to the civil power, as enjoined in the New Testament. While we thus cheerfully render to Caesar the things which the Scriptures show to be his, we are compelled to decline all participation in acts of war and bloodshed as being inconsistent with the duties enjoined upon us by our divine Master toward our enemies and toward all mankind. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now here's a question that is often asked. Were they pacifists? There are some members of Adventist Peace Fellowship that say, well, the church was pacifist and it turned away from that. Well, what is a pacifist? Did you know the term was only invented in 1901? And it comes from Émile Arnaud. He was the president of the International League for Peace and Liberty in France, and he coined the term pacifism, and it was adopted at the 10th Universal Peace Congress in Glasgow. And here's the explanation of what it was intended for. It was meant to suggest a coherent body of thought and developed set of political beliefs and policies for preventing war and assuring peace. The term was officially adopted at the Glasgow Congress. Thereafter, those who participated in the various peace organizations and societies around the world began to refer to themselves as pacifists. It was a term of distinction and had a broad social connotation. It was meant to encompass all of those who work to preserve peace and prevent war. So, were the early Adventists in the 19th century pacifists? No. There was nobody then using the term pacifist. And also look at how pacifist was understood. Those who were working politically. It was a political movement to end the use of war as a national strategy and to use only peace. Were the Adventists concerned of that? No. They saw that the church was separate from the state. They saw that believers had obligation to God that were different from their obligations to the state. It was all about the nature of the church, not the nature of the state. They didn't care what the state did, though they saw it as violating the law of God. But they were talking about themselves and the call to follow Jesus, which is upon the Christian and upon the church, not upon the state. So they would have said, no, we are not pacifists because we're not of a political movement to end political violence. Now, some things did change with the 20th century with new challenges. And Adventists really didn't talk about much about war after the Civil War until World War I, because the U.S. was involved in no major wars in this time. There were individuals who were affected, but there was no big draft. There was no push. There was no pressure upon the church to say something. Then came World War I. And 1917, the North American division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church said, "We hereby reaffirm the foregoing declaration." Which declaration was that? The church's statement from 1865. We reaffirm that that is still our teaching today. We petition that our religious convictions be recognized by those in authority, and that we be required to serve our country only in such capacity as will not violate our conscientious obedience to the law of God as contained in the Decalogue, interpreted in the teachings of Christ, and exemplified in his life. Notice that it was not the General Conference, it was the North American division that was taking this stand. Not everybody did. And despite legal provisions protecting conscientious objectors, not only Seventh-day Adventists, but Mennonites, Amish, Hutterites, Jehovah's Witnesses, and members of other groups opposed to war were often imprisoned, including some Hutterites who were imprisoned at Alcatraz, and then Fort Leavenworth. 2 Hutterites died as martyrs at Fort Leavenworth. In the United Kingdom, 17 Seventh-day Adventists were imprisoned at Dartmoor Prison. With World War I, the earlier peace movement collapsed, and even Émile Arnaud threw away his pacifist beliefs and joined the military and fought and won the Croix de Guerre for his bravery in battle. There was also direct persecution, investigation, and censorship of the churches in the United States by what was then known as the Bureau of Investigation, which later became the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. Kevin Burton has written, "During World War I, scores of Adventists, both lay and clergy, along with many of their institutions, were regularly watched by government agents and their associates. State agents secretly infiltrated the denomination's churches and camp meetings, intercepted and confiscated their telegrams, letters, and packages, harassed and imprisoned coal porters, confiscated and destroyed numerous publications, and forced leaders to revise and republish several books and tracts. The federal government targeted Adventists because of their apocalyptic views, emphasis on non-combatancy, supposed religious fanaticism, and racial demographics. They especially targeted German-speaking Seventh-day Adventist schools, outreach to German immigrants, German publications, and so on. And it wasn't just the Seventh-day Adventists. Jehovah's Witnesses, Quakers, Mennonites, and even all the holiness and Pentecostal churches founded in the 1890s and in the early 1900s, they were all non-resistant to begin with, and pressure was put upon them to give up those beliefs, and gradually they did. One of the last official statements of change was that of the Assemblies of God, who made a public statement during the Vietnam War that they were no longer holding to that non-combatant, non-resistant view. Some of this period of what the Bureau of Investigation was doing in these churches, it's only been written about in the past 15, 20 years as more of the documents have been released to the public, and we saw the extent to which they went. They investigated the leadership of the Jehovah's Witnesses and put them all in prison for their refusal to bend. And they came to the Adventist Publishing House. The 1919 Bible Conference, about which Michael Campbell has written a book, and it was rediscovered in the 1970s. And today it's looked at mainly because of the debates that they had about the role of Ellen White in the church and incoming of fundamentalism. Well, they also discussed this infiltration, this pressure upon the church from the federal government. E.R. Palmer, the manager of the Review and Herald, speaking on July 17th, 1919, said, "I want to apologize at least for the rather radical thing that we did during the war period in dealing with the book Bible Readings for the Home Circle. And perhaps that will get one point before us in a little more concrete form. When we got into the war, we found ourselves in some embarrassment over this chapter in Bible Readings." So what chapter was it? It was the chapter on the United States in prophecy that said the United States was this beast rising out of the land that had two horns like a lamb and spake like a dragon, this demonic power. That is the United States. We found ourselves in some embarrassment over this chapter. Our agents were selling it extensively, and the authorities were very active in looking up matter that we were publishing to see if we didn't belong in the penitentiary with the leaders of another denomination, the Jehovah's Witnesses, that had just previously been examined, and the same men who were under the government and putting the leaders of the Russellite movement in the penitentiary came to our headquarters to see where we belonged, whether inside or out. This led us to much earnest study as to what we should do in handling many of our books, and to look up that chapter in Bible Readings. And we changed the first four questions, or rather the notes to these questions, so as to give a little different slant to the subject. And I've been surprised, but there's been no protest that has come to us since that time. I thought perhaps you brethren would know better whether it's being protested against. So he's saying we substantially changed Adventist teaching on this subject. Instead of saying that we see now through the actions of the United States and its embrace of violence and slavery that it is even now this hypocritical monster, oh, well, we will see this will only be true in the future when it enacts Sunday law. Till then, we're going to be good patriots. So they changed not only this book, but also books by GC President A.G. Daniels, by Carlisle B. Haynes, who became the chair of the War Service Commission and the main leader of church relations on the issue of military issues. They bent over backwards to show, look, we're not like the Jehovah's Witnesses. We're patriotic. We'll do whatever you want to keep from going to jail. We will change our beliefs just so that we don't have to suffer for them. Now, what an amazing thing. Here you have this denomination that for its whole history has been saying the time is coming when we have to stand up for what's right against persecution by the state. We have to stand up for the Sabbath and our beliefs. And they're saying, oh, no, don't hurt us. We'll change. We'll do whatever you want. Just don't send us to jail. What blatant hypocrisy. Nationalism and fear won the day. And here you go. Here was this original state sent a picture from 1853. And here's how they changed it. And if you've read Adventist books on the subject, you'll recognize these depictions. Either it's pictured as a cute little lamb that's innocent now and nice and all about freedom and justice, and only in the future will it start acting like a dragon. Or a buffalo. This is the lamb-like beast. And it's not called a lamb-like beast. It's a beast that has two horns like a lamb. So sometimes it's depicted as a buffalo rising up out of an empty space. That's why land versus water, they said. The water that the first beast comes from represents all the great population of Europe, and this nation comes up in a place where there's nobody. Well, wait a second. There were millions of Native Americans that were here in this place. So they just looked over genocide. That was not part of their view of the dragonish nature of the United States, what it had done to exterminate. And even then, was oppressing Native Americans and depriving them of their religious liberty. You know, the early Adventists, Ellen White, even though she talked about slavery, never once did she express any concern for the plight of Native Americans. Never once did she express any sympathy. Never once did she say, as she said for blacks in the South, that they should be evangelized. They just didn't exist, except once in a while she said she saw them from the train. So there's lots of problematic issues here with how the Adventist Church in this period embraced nationalism and saw that the U.S. could do no wrong, only in the future. Till then, till they press that specific issue of the Sabbath, we want to show what good patriots we are, and we will give in on anything else. The church in Germany had the same basic approach. If they're not asking us to keep Sunday, we will give in on everything else in the name of nationalism. Louis Conradi was the president of the church in Germany, and he had been an evangelist in the United States. He had worked with Ellen White. He had even converted a whole Mennonite town in the upper Midwest. And interestingly, they didn't come in saying, oh, yay, here's another denomination that's against war. No, the Sabbath was the only thing that they pushed. The church, under Conradi's leadership in Germany, told members that they had a duty to defend the fatherland. They should not worry about the Sabbath. They should forget about the church's teachings on the military and bearing arms, and they should put both of those beliefs aside to defend the fatherland. Those members who refused were disfellowshipped, causing a split in the church and the creation of the German Reformed movement. The German church also embraced nationalism in World War II. Hitler was a vegetarian. He was restoring German pride. He was reviving the economy, and they willingly turned out and turned over Jewish converts to Adventism. Here's some official statements. August 1st, 1914, Germany declared full mobilization. August 2nd, Germany invaded Luxembourg. And on August 2nd, G. Dial, the Secretary for the European Division, wrote, "We should do our military duties cheerfully whilst we are in service or being called to serve, so that the officers in charge will find in us valiant and true soldiers who are ready to die for their homes, for our army, and for our fatherland." H.F. Schubert, Union President, 2 days later, "We have bound ourselves together in the defense of the fatherland, and under these circumstances we will also bear arms on Saturday." And in the publication Der Christ und der Krieg, The Christian and War, in 1916, "In all that we have said, we have shown that the Bible teaches, first, that taking part in war is not a transgression of the sixth commandment. Second, that doing military service on the Sabbath is not a transgression of the fourth commandment." It is so clear. They just completely rejected everything that the Adventist Church had taught up to that point. 1918, in a publication in Dresden, an Adventist official was writing, "At the beginning of the war, our organization was split into two parties. As 98% of our membership, by searching the Bible, came to the conviction that they are duty-bound by conscience to defend the country with weapons also on Saturdays, this position, unanimously endorsed by the leadership, was immediately announced to the War Ministry. 2%, however, did not submit to this resolution and therefore had to be disfellowshipped because of their unchristian conduct. These unprofitable elements set themselves up as preachers and, with little result, sought to make converts to their propaganda of foolish ideas. They call themselves falsely preachers and Adventists. They are not. They are deceivers. When such elements receive their merited punishment, we regard it, in fact, as a favor done to us." What were they doing that was so terrible? This 2%? They were simply holding on to what had been official Seventh-day Adventist teaching. So who was the apostate? It was the 98% of the German Seventh-day Adventists. It was the entirety of the German Seventh-day Adventist leadership. The result, as I said, was the splintering of a group that became known as the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement, or the German Reform Movement, a denomination that exists to this day. There was an attempted reconciliation in 1920. There was a church representative that came to Germany to see what had happened, and he was just appalled by the action that was taken by Conradi and the leadership. But the church never disciplined. The General Conference never disciplined any of the church leadership. They didn't tell them you need to reconcile. They didn't tell them, they didn't disfellowship those who so readily abandoned Seventh-day Adventist teaching. At the General Conference session, some representatives came and they wanted to speak. They wanted to share their story, but not a single person would talk to them. And therefore, they formally organized in 1925. In 2005, the official church in Germany apologized for its actions related to the Holocaust, but said nothing about the treatment of conscientious objectors in World War I and World War II. In 2014, there was a dialogue between the two groups, but it was pushed not by the old school, but by young scholars who said, it's been 100 years. We should be talking together once more. Between the wars, there were many churches that wanted to set about to make sure that they were on a more solid footing in the case of the next war. So in 1922, there was a gathering called the Conference of Pacifist Churches, and they used that term, pacifist. And it was the Mennonites, the Friends or Quakers, and the Church of the Brethren. In 1935, they changed the name of the group to the Conference of Historic Peace Churches. And that's the first use of this term, the Historic Peace Churches, to refer to these groups. And a group with the same name was established in Canada in 1940. But the Seventh-day Adventists didn't join. They weren't part of it. There's no discussion about, and I haven't seen whether they were even invited or any discussion about it. But here is when you start having this talk of historic peace churches and these churches working together to make sure that they were exempted in future wars from military service. 1933, though, the Adventist leaders wrote to the government in Canada, like the Quakers, it has been the universal faith and practice of Seventh-day Adventists from their origin to aid and sustain civil government in all its legitimate functions, but they have always held conscientiously that as Christians they cannot participate in the taking of human life, although they are willing to aid and support the government in time of war in a non-combatant capacity. Here, Adventists again saying, we are like the Quakers. So I wish that they would have become part of that conference of historic peace churches. They should have, based on the policy and the teachings of the church in the 19th century. But instead, in both America and in Germany, the attitude became, no, we need to show that we are super patriots. 1934, the General Conference took this action to explain what it meant by being non-combatant. Non-combatants are willing to aid their government in every consistent way in time of warfare except by taking human life. They will help to feed and clothe the army, assist in caring for the sick and wounded, help to bury the dead, aid in the transportation of men, food, clothing, etc. They will build the camps, go into the fields, mines, and factories at the direction of the government. They will help to fortify positions and otherwise protect human life. They will carry the wounded back from the front. The non-combatant is not a coward. He is simply and conscientiously and courageously objects to taking human life so far as his participation is concerned. The church does not attempt to dictate to its members individually, but each person must stand upon his own conscientious convictions. Now remember that little conscience clause. It'll come back. But it's important to note that it was already there in 1934. See, there are some Adventists who say the church backslid when it introduced a conscience clause like this in the 1970s, but here it is in 1934. And notice, they didn't limit being a non-combatant to being a medic. They thought you could also be part of logistics, supply, transportation, engineering, cooking, all these different things, as long as you were not infantry or artillery up on the front line involved in direct combat with the enemy. And it wasn't we as a church, it's our individual members. We want them to have the individual right of conscience to say no. It's all about the individual. It's not about the teaching of the church. One of the things that the church did, starting at Union College in Lincoln, Nebraska, they said, let's find a way to prepare our young people so that they can go into non-combatant life-saving roles in an event of another draft. And so they got together with the Nebraska National Guard, said, what are the standards that the Army has for training medics? And let's start training our academy or high school and college students so that they qualify as medics. And they called this the Medical Cadet Corps. And it was in operation from 1934 to 1973. The Fort Worth Telegram on January 13th, 1941, wrote about one such summer camp in Keene, Texas. And the writer said, Adventists are not conscientious objectors, they are conscientious cooperators. And Carlisle Haynes, the evangelist and the head of the War Service Commission, said, that's it. That's what we want to call ourselves, conscientious cooperators. And of course, the most famous person to use this term and the exemplar of this attitude was Desmond Doss, the first non-combatant to be the recipient of the Medal of Honor for his actions during World War II. He went in wanting to fight Japan, but without carrying a weapon. He volunteered. He was not drafted. And at the World War II Museum in New Orleans, there's a plaque that is wrong. He volunteered. He could have had an exemption because he was working in shipbuilding at the time at Newport News. But he volunteered, and that's why they had a hard time giving him that non-combatant status. They assumed that this goes to people who are drafted. But he volunteered because he believed in the war effort, but he did not want to take life. He became the exemplar for the next generation of Adventists of what the attitude should be towards military service. So let's talk more about Carlisle Haynes. He was an interesting person. Here, he is trying to show how super patriotic Adventists are. And in the 1950s, he will extend this super patriotism to show why we do not believe in the civil rights movement, why we support segregation, why we don't believe in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man and all that communist liberal stuff. We're good Americans, he said, and we're going to show just how super patriotic we were. So here he's writing in 1940. We have insisted that we are not conscientious objectors, meaning we do not oppose war, we do not agitate against war, we do not organize against war, we make no protest against war, we are not unwilling to serve in the military organization when drafted, we are not opposed to saluting the flag, and we are not opposed to wearing our country's uniform. So he's saying, don't think of us like Quakers or Mennonites or Brethren or Jehovah's Witnesses. Don't put us in that category with them whatsoever. We have taken the position that we want a well-defined separation drawn between ourselves and war resistors, pacifists, conscientious objectors to war, and all others who refuse service to their country. We have designated our position as that of non-combatants. We do not object to serving our country in time of war. Our objection is to the taking of human life. But wait a second, how can you support an organization that is taking human life and claim to be separate from it? It makes no sense. That's how these other groups looked at the Adventist position. In another article, he said, non-combatancy is not pacifism. Pacifism maintains a substantial and powerful organization which agitates against war. Non-combatancy maintains no organizations, carries on no agitation, supports no propaganda, appeals for no members. It merely maintains its Christian faith. Non-combatancy is not conscientious objection to war service, but it maintains the attitude and conviction that war does not change the individual Christian's obligation of obedience to God. It's an individual thing. Christian non-combatants will participate in any service which will contribute to the saving, the maintenance, and the well-being of human life. But they hold that their supreme allegiance to God prevents them from taking life. Christian non-combatancy is not anti-militarism, which would banish the military establishment and do away with uniforms and flags, which opposes military orders, drills, insignia, procedures, activities, and appropriations. Christian non-combatancy concerns itself only with the individual's accountability and relationship to God. Always, everywhere, in every condition and circumstance, the individual Christian non-combatant puts God's will first. A Christian non-combatant will not refuse to participate in the military establishment or to wear his country's uniform. He will salute his country's flag. He will aid his country in its need. Well, let's head back over to Germany. And I've already alluded to this, how the German church did not learn its lesson from World War I. And it continued in the same patriotic path that Carlyle Haynes was outlining for the church in the United States, but going even further. It's not now an individual right to not bear arms. Now the church must enforce the country's will and say that's all that matters. We are not unprepared for the new order, said Adolf Mink. After all, we have helped prepare the way for it and have helped to bring it about. Wilhelm Müller, as an anti-alcoholic, non-smoker, and a vegetarian, Hitler is closer to our own view of health reform than anybody else. Adolf Mink again. At this occasion, I may once again assure you that the members of our denomination stand loyally by the Führer and the Reich. They are continually encouraged and supported in their basic attitude. The leadership of the denomination considers this as one of its most noble duties. And, said a historian, the German Adventist leaders never admitted that they made any mistakes in the years afterwards. It was against their national pride and their continued rationalization of their actions during the Nazi regime. And once more, nobody in church leadership was disfellowshipped by the Seventh-day Adventist Church or punished in any way for their actions in supporting Nazism. In the 1950s, a new thing came about showing the willingness of the Adventist Church to collaborate with the military, showing their patriotism. The draft continued through Korea and after. In 1954, the Army approached the General Conference and suggested that Adventist medics be asked to volunteer for a project to use human subjects for experimentation into germ warfare, tracing how pathogens affected the body, developing vaccines, and improving procedures for handling virulent pathogens. This was Operation Whitecoat, conducted by what became the U.S. Army Research Institute on Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID, at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and continued until the end of the draft in 1973. 2,300 Seventh-day Adventist medics participated. A leader from the church would join somebody from USAMRIID to talk to the class of AIT, Advanced Individual Training students at Fort Sam Houston and San Antonio, all the new medics. They'd separate the Seventh-day Adventists out, who were a large portion, and say, hey, we'd like to give you the chance to volunteer. Church says this is good, this isn't going to hurt you, and this is a way to serve in saving and preserving life. And so they applied, some were accepted, and then I've talked about this more in another case, in another presentation, but the government made effort to follow what were called the Nuremberg Protocols, to make sure that ethics were followed, that there was informed consent, that nobody was harmed. And USAMRIID has continued to follow up and has seen no direct correlation between any hazards, health hazards, since their service and their service in Operation Whitecoat. But the point of it was, again, to show that the church was willing to cooperate with the government and the military in any way that did not involve taking of human life. During the Vietnam War. Notice they tweaked a couple of words. No longer did it say the Seventh-day Adventists take a non-combatant position, but the Seventh-day Adventists advocate a non-combatant position. They encourage it, they do not require it. And they re-added that conscience clause from 1934. This statement is not a rigid position binding church members, but gives guidance, leaving the individual member free to assess the situation for himself. Now, why did they add this? The draft system during the Vietnam War had you either 1A, a combatant, you'll go in, do whatever, 1O, an objector, you don't want to serve at all, or 1AO, you will serve but as a non-combatant. That was the position of the church. We want people to go in as 1AO. But there were people who were coming to oppose the Vietnam War and want nothing to do with it. There were increasing numbers of young Adventists saying, no, we are pacifists. We are conscientious objectors. We want nothing to do with it. And they'd go before draft boards, and draft boards would say, well, that's not the position of your church. And so this was put in to allow Adventist young people to take a pacifist position. The result, though, was that it also gave carte blanche for Adventists to take a combatant position. This wasn't so much in Vietnam. And of course, then the draft ended. And there were some leaders that went out to academies and colleges in those first years to say, hey, this is what we think you should do in the case of a volunteer army, that you won't be able to be a non-combatant unless you're medical or chaplain. Even a medic will have to carry weapons. So they encouraged people not to join. But after September 11th, there was a surge of patriotism, and there were younger Adventists who joined the military as combatants, having never been taught that there was a problem with it. In fact, when I gave a sermon on this subject at a church, at a very large Adventist church in the Midwest, the pastor came up to me afterwards and said, how can you say that Adventists are against military service? Are you saying my grandfather was wrong for fighting in World War II? I've never heard such a thing. And this person had a theology degree from an Adventist college. He had a Master of Divinity degree from the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary. And he said never in his theology, ethics, or history classes did he ever encounter the fact that the Adventists had a non-combatant history. Well, because of a feeling that people were forgetting, Ted Wilson, the president of the General Conference, called for a conference on the subject in the year 2019, The State of Military Service in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Combatants, Non-Combatants, Conscientious Objectors. And Elder Wilson said, "We understand that in some countries non-combatancy options are not available, and Adventists are required to serve in their country's military. Even then, these young believers are encouraged to find ways to be faithful to God while serving their country. If members find themselves in the military, whether by personal choice or conscription, the Church, through Adventist chaplaincy ministries and other avenues, tries to spiritually minister to them." So there's nothing here even about conscience. Nothing here about church advocating for its members. Oh, if the state requires you, well, just be the best you can do. Do the best you can do. It's a total capitulation. He said we still believe in non-combatancy. He says, as Seventh-day Adventists, we have maintained a historic witness in favor of peace and non-combatancy throughout the 151 years of the Church's existence. But Ted, you're saying here in some countries we can't do that, so c'est la vie. Furthermore, our pastors who serve as chaplains in the military have had a big impact in serving those who've chosen to serve in the military. They've been able to reach those who may not have been able to be reached in other circumstances, and we appreciate the challenging yet professional service they provide. So where are we at today? Well, Adventists started off by insisting that they keep all the commandments, and they singled out number 4 and number 6. But now it's like number 6 isn't so important. We won't require you to keep it. It's just a suggestion. Now, some Europeans are not happy with that. And Frank Hazel and Barna Magyarosi published this compilation, Adventists and Military Service, Biblical, Historical, and Ethical Perspectives, saying we need to go back to that early Adventist standpoint. They're much more of a pacifist, complete conscientious objection approach, and they just cannot believe what the United States has done. They can't believe that we have military chaplains, and Barna and I have talked about this, and he came to better understand when I told about what my experience was. And I corresponded some with Frank Hazel, too, about this book. And my disappointment was they talk a lot about what Adventists in the U.S. military can do, but they never talked to any military chaplains. But I honor Frank and Barna for saying this is the Adventist approach, and we need to teach it, and we need to reaffirm it. But I was disappointed in the organization that I worked for, Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries. Lately, it's come to say it's basically your choice. It doesn't really matter either way. We may offer a non-combatant perspective, but regardless of which way you go, that's your choice. We don't care. Thou shalt not kill. Oh, well, we really need to understand, said one person speaking at that conference in 2019. Well, it really says thou shalt not murder. And it's not murder if you're doing it in the military. So killing in the military is okay. Well, that's not what early Adventists taught at all. And in fact, Jerry Moscala, the dean of the seminary, gave a paper at that same conference saying, no, that is not what the Hebrew says. There is no distinction. Killing is killing. Well, the church has always had diverse attitudes. Some say, oh, look at all the debate in the Civil War. Oh, and Ellen White said nice things when she saw a member of the Swiss military with medals. She was impressed. And German history shows the necessity of a pragmatic response. And there's a tendency to flatten the Bible. Oh, let's not worry about what Jesus said. Oh, look at all the great things that were said about Cornelius. Look at all the praising of soldiers in the Old Testament. Look at God's commands to kill. So the Old Testament, in effect, overrules Jesus. And these cause some puzzlements to me. Your choice, it doesn't matter. Well, what if Adventism took that approach to the Sabbath, to diet, to sexuality? My mother got disfellowshipped for working at a restaurant on the Sabbath when my dad was out of work. When I was at academy, I asked to be able to not have to work in the cafeteria on the Sabbath, and they said, no, tough, you have to, you're required to. There was no freedom of conscience to me, and my mother certainly wasn't given that approach. Oh, it's your choice, doesn't matter. Oh, diet? Oh, you want to be vegetarian or not? That's okay. Well, Adventists will say that. But, oh, want to go to a crawfish boil? Sure, go ahead. Eat lobster. In New England, the Adventist Church is not going to say that. It's going to say, you eat these things, you're going to be disfellowshipped. Sexuality, does the Adventist Church say it's your choice? It doesn't matter. No. Church leadership won't even talk to LGBTQ Adventists. It's a hard and fast rule. And on abortion, they used to say, it's your choice, we want to guide you in it. But now, when they drafted new statements on it, they didn't even want to hear from physicians or chaplains about the struggles that women have in making decisions. They just wanted to have a hard, fast, legalistic rule. So that does not make any sense to me. Why, in this one thing of killing another person, you get a choice, but not in these other things? And this pragmatic approach, it won't work in some countries. So that approach led the Adventist Church to bow to Germany in World War I and World War II. It went along with the Soviet Union and disfellowshipped those people who insisted on their own religious liberty. Alexander Shulkov, the free and true Seventh-day Adventist, the church was always just branding him a fanatic and not a representative of the Adventist Church. Never did Liberty Magazine during the Cold War talk about religious liberty issues in the Soviet Union. Or other communist countries today, the church talks about how great it's growing in China. But certain folks that are familiar with some of these communist countries say, well, it doesn't matter which denomination, Catholic, Protestant, or Buddhist, or what have you, they're all divisions of the state. The state gives the pastors sermons to preach on being good members of your family, obedient members of the state, get along well with people. That's the approach. And never do they stand up and say, hey, we need to stand up to this hostility to religion. We need to stand up against requiring us to kill. We need to stand up against the forced observance of the Sabbath, breaking of the Sabbath. No. Pragmatic. Do what the country says. Well, then what became of the Adventist stand? That, oh, we have to stand, that trouble is coming. We need to stand for separation of church and state so that the Sunday laws aren't passed, and we need to be able to stand firm when there's Sunday laws. But the Adventist Church has shown that it will give in on every other single thing just to appease government. And so Adventism will wave the nationalistic flag in the United States, in Germany, in all these other places to get privilege, to get safety, so as not to suffer. How is that any different from Babylon in the book of Revelation? That faithless woman who's willing to give in on everything just to have this special prestige of riding on the back of the beast, which will in the end turn and tear her and destroy her, John says. The Adventist Church went down a slippery slope. It went from having a consistent, biblically based approach to following Jesus and not killing, to saying in the end, this is the one of the 10 Commandments that doesn't really matter. Do whatever the government tells you.